Why did he say it that way? The words echoed through the crowded high school auditorium, sharp, mocking, meant to draw blood. Your mom's a Navy SEAL. Sure, kid. Does she fight bad guys in video games too? A ripple of uneasy laughter spread through the students. It wasn't cruel at first, just nervous, confused, the kind that fills silence when no one knows how to react. But then it grew louder, freer, until it became a wave of open amusement. At the center of it all stood a 14-year-old boy named Leo. Thin, composed, quiet. His face gave away nothing. No blush of shame, no flash of anger, just stillness like someone who'd learned to breathe through storms. Across from him, in his crisp uniform and perfect smile, stood Lieutenant Mark Davis, the Navy's recruitment officer for the day. The kind of man who looked like he'd stepped straight off a poster. Tall, squared shoulders, hair that hadn't known wind in years. Everything about him was polished, from his brass buttons to the gleam in his eyes when he found someone to stand above. The laughter died down, but the silence that followed was worse. Davis crossed his arms, his smirk unbroken. "What's the matter, son? Cat got your tongue? Or did mommy order you not to talk back?" Leo didn't flinch, didn't speak. He just looked the man straight in the eyes, not as a challenge, but as if holding his ground was enough. From the back of the hall, an older man, an admiral, though no one recognized him, leaned forward slightly in his seat. He'd seen that expression before, that stillness, that refusal to be provoked. It wasn't defiance. It was discipline. The career fair was in full swing. Booths and banners lined the gymnasium floor, bright colors, loud speakers, recruiters promising futures. The Navy table had the biggest crowd. Brochures glistened with photos of destroyers cutting through waves, jets tearing across the sky, and slogans about honor and courage. Lieutenant Davis was in his element. He sold dreams for a living. His voice carried authority, his smile carried charm. Kids lined up for selfies, for stories, for stickers shaped like anchors. Leo hadn't come for any of that. He'd been waiting patiently, just to ask a technical question, something about satellite communication encryption, something he'd overheard his mother mention once, half a sentence while unpacking gear after a deployment. When he finally got to the front, Davis had barely looked up. "And what can I do for you, sport? Thinking about joining up someday?" Leo had shaken his head slightly. "No, sir. I just wanted to ask about the communication system your SEAL teams use. How does?" Davis had blinked, then interrupted with a small, amused frown. "Your SEAL teams?" Leo nodded. "My mother's a commander with the teams." For a second, Davis thought he'd misheard. Then came the smirk. "A commander in the SEALs? Son, that's cute." His voice rose, catching the attention of nearby students. "Hey, everyone, this young man says his mom is a SEAL. Isn't that adorable?" The laughter that followed wasn't innocent anymore. It was sport, and Davis enjoyed every second of it. He leaned in closer to Leo, lowering his voice just enough that the nearby crowd still caught every word. "Let me tell you something, kid. I've met SEALs, real ones. Men who have walked through hell and come back. They don't bake cookies for PTA meetings. They break bones and bleed grit. You understand?" Leo didn't answer, didn't blink, just stood there. Davis chuckled, thinking silence meant surrender. "Go on now, run along, leave the real work to the men." The line hit harder than he expected, not because of its cruelty, but because of what followed. Nothing. No reaction, no argument, just quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavier than shouting. Leo's eyes stayed on him, calm, unwavering. And for a moment, that silence started to eat at Davis. He cleared his throat, straightened, and decided to turn it into a teachable moment. He raised his voice again, calling out to the crowd. "Listen up, everyone. You want to know what separates talkers from warriors? It's this." He tapped his chest. "It's heart, it's endurance, it's surviving Bud S training, the hardest program on earth. Freezing water, no sleep, pushing logs until your bones feel like glass. That's what being a SEAL takes. You think a soccer mom could handle that? He laughed again, scanning the crowd for support. The laughter came weaker this time, forced. And then, a sound. Soft, mechanical. The double doors at the back of the hall began to open, slowly. Light spilled in, bright, cold daylight cutting across the polished floor. Heads turned, conversation stopped, even Davis's practiced speech faltered. 7 figures entered. They didn't move like civilians. No wasted motion, no hesitation, every step measured, fluid like wolves moving through a forest. Their presence hit the room like pressure, something primal that made the air feel tighter. They wore no dress uniforms, no medals, just functional combat gear, faded multicam, light plate carriers, boots that had seen real mud and blood. Their equipment was worn, not parade clean, but used, real. Weapons were slung low, safeties locked but ready. The kind of readiness that never fully switches off. At the front of the group walked someone slightly smaller than the rest, but her bearing made her larger than all of them. The cap pulled low over her face shadowed her eyes, but not her authority. She walked like gravity bent around her. And she wasn't looking around. Her gaze was locked. Straight ahead. At Leo. The auditorium fell into absolute silence. The sound of boots on the floor, soft, deliberate, filled the space where laughter had been. Davis felt it before he understood it, the shift in the air, the cold crawl of realization. The older admiral in the back of the room stood. The sound of his shoes against the tile cut through the silence. He walked forward with a deliberate calm, each step echoing in the stillness. He stopped in front of the woman, squared his shoulders, and saluted sharp, perfect, unwavering. "Commander Anya Shaw," he said, his voice carrying through the stunned hall. "Good to have you home. Mission accomplished." She returned the salute with quiet precision. "Yes, Admiral Hayes. All team members accounted for. Mission successful." The Admiral's eyes softened. Then he turned to the frozen lieutenant. "Lieutenant Davis," he said, voice low but deadly clear. "Allow me to introduce Commander Anya Shaw, call sign Kestrel, Naval Special Warfare Development Group." The silence deepened. A few students exchanged glances, not fully understanding. Then a murmur began to ripple through the crowd. Dev grew. The name civilians rarely heard, the official designation of SEAL Team 6. The elite of the elite. Commander Shaw had returned from a 48-hour hostage rescue in hostile waters less than 2 hours ago. She hadn't stopped for rest. She hadn't gone home. She'd come here because her son had a school event. The Admiral let that hang in the air. Then, softly, she insisted on being here in time for her boy. The silence broke only when someone exhaled. Davis looked like he'd been drained of color. His chest rose and fell shallowly. The Admiral continued, his tone shifting from formal to instructive. "A warrior," he said, addressing the crowd now, "is not measured by size or gender or the volume of his voice. A warrior is measured by action, discipline, and the refusal to quit when it matters most." He turned back to Davis. "And this woman," he said, his voice hardening, "embodies those principles better than any soldier I've met in 40 years. Anya Shaw didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply placed a hand on her son's shoulder, a small, grounding gesture that said everything. In that silence, the truth of everything Davis had said before burned away. No one laughed, no one even moved. The hall was still, not out of fear, but respect, the kind that comes when people realize they've been standing in the presence of something real. Outside, the light had shifted. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, glinting off the patches on Anya's vest, subdued flags, worn call signs, the faint outline of a trident. Leo looked up at her, eyes steady. She gave him a small nod, not pride, not performance, just acknowledgement. Mission complete. For the first time in his career, Lieutenant Davis had no words. His entire world, the hierarchy, the image, the certainty of what strength looked like, cracked open in front of him. The Admiral broke the silence. "Let this day serve as a reminder," he said. "True warriors don't shout their worth, they carry it quietly." And with that he turned, signaling to the commander. Anya nodded once, her team pivoting smoothly. They moved as one, a human tide, silent, efficient. Phones came out, capturing fragments of what had just happened, but no video could hold that moment. The soundless authority, the weight of earned respect. Davis stood there, staring at the door, the echo of boots still ringing in his ears. He felt smaller than he ever had in his life, but somewhere deep inside that humiliation, something shifted. He understood. And somewhere in the stunned silence of that hall, so did everyone else. Because strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just walks in, says nothing, and changes everything. No one moved for a full minute after they left. It was like the air itself refused to breathe. Then the murmur began, low, unsure, rippling from one side of the auditorium to the other. Students whispering, parents craning their necks, teachers frozen halfway between disbelief and awe. The laughter that had filled the hall earlier seemed like a sound from another world. And there, at the center of it all, still stood Lieutenant Mark Davis. He didn't know what to do with his hands. They hung at his sides like they no longer belonged to him. His chest felt tight, as if the entire room had shrunk around him. He wanted to say something, anything. A joke, an apology, a command. But every word that rose in his throat died before it reached air. Because what could he possibly say? He had mocked a boy. He had mocked a mother. And that mother had walked into his world and dismantled it. Not with anger, not with words, but with presence. That kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The Admiral's final words echoed in his mind. True warriors don't shout their worth. They carry it quietly. Davis turned, scanning the hall as if searching for something to hold onto, a reaction, a face that would anchor him. But every eye that met his was different now. Where there had been laughter earlier, there was only silence. Not even pity, just quiet judgment. Leo was gone. His mother, too. The only trace of them was the ghost of that moment, the light on the floor where she'd stood. He exhaled, but it didn't help. His breath came out shaky, uneven. He felt the weight of 100 eyes still on him, waiting for what he'd do next. So he did the only thing that came naturally to him. He straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and pretended everything was fine. But the cracks were there, deep, spreading. He gathered his brochures, stacked them carefully, as if order could erase what had happened. Then he packed his things and left before anyone could speak to him. Outside, the afternoon sun hit his face, harsh and indifferent. The noise of traffic, birds, and the world going on as usual felt wrong, as if reality had forgotten to stop for him. He walked to his car without really seeing, sat inside, closed the door. And then finally, when no one could see him, he let his hands shake. God, what did I just do? He pressed his palms to his eyes and leaned back against the seat. the image replaying over and over. That woman, the silence, the admiral's salute. A commander, a SEAL, a mother. He had never felt so small. Inside the school, the legend was already spreading. Phones buzzed in every hallway. Students whispered at lockers. Messages bounced through group chats and social feeds. The story twisted and expanded as stories always do. Did you see her eyes? She was at the back of the hall the whole time. They said she came straight from a mission. Her whole team was there. By the end of the day, every student at Northwood High knew what had happened, or thought they did. Some exaggerated, some embellished, but the truth was already larger than the moment itself. Leo sat quietly at one of the picnic tables behind the school. The noise of gossip was distant out here. He held a sandwich his mother had packed that morning, the same one she'd promised she'd try to be back in time to share. He hadn't really believed she would make it, not after what she'd told him about her operation, but she had, somehow. He looked down at the bread, uneaten, and smiled faintly. Then a shadow fell across the table. She was there, still in uniform though the cap was gone now. Her hair was damp, face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes, those clear, steady eyes, softened the moment they met his. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down across from him, exhaling slowly, the kind of breath that comes after days without sleep. He watched her hands, rough, scarred, veins visible under the skin. Hands that had built things, carried things, saved lives. He thought of how those same hands had bandaged his scraped knees when he was 6. "Mom," he said quietly, "you didn't have to do that." Her lips curved, not quite a smile. "Do what?" "Show up like that, in front of everyone." She looked down, folded her hands, thought for a moment. "I didn't do it for them," she said softly. "I did it for you." He looked away, embarrassed. "Yeah, but now everyone's talking. They're saying you walked into your school with a team of ghosts," she finished gently. "Let them talk, people always do." He smiled at that, a small, tired smile. For a while, neither spoke. The wind rustled the trees, carrying the faint echo of laughter from across the field. Finally, Leo asked, "Were you angry at him?" She shook her head. "Anger's a luxury I can't afford, Leo. Not in my line of work, not in life." He frowned, "But he insulted you." She reached across the table, placed her hand over his. "He insulted what he doesn't understand. That's different." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of sadness beneath it, the kind only someone who's seen too much carries. "You'll meet people like him," she said. "People who mistake noise for confidence, arrogance for strength. You can't fight them with anger. You prove them wrong by how you live. That's all." Leo nodded slowly. He didn't fully understand yet, but something about the way she said it, steady, grounded, made it feel true. She took a bite of her sandwich then, finally. "You still wanted to ask me about the satellite communication system." He blinked, surprised. "You remember that?" Her lips curved again, that same faint, knowing smile. "I remember everything that matters." He grinned a little then, relief breaking through the weight of the day. For a few minutes, they talked about signals and encryption and how data traveled through orbit, small, normal things that anchored them back to each other. But under it all, something deeper moved, unspoken pride, silent respect. A bond forged not from heroics but from presence. That evening, the story had reached the nearby naval base. In mess halls and ready rooms, officers replayed it like folklore. It wasn't just gossip, it was a parable, a reminder. The lieutenant who mocked a SEAL's kid. The mother who showed up with her team. The silence that followed. By midnight, the story had already taken on a name, the Northwood lesson. No one could verify every detail. No one cared. The core of it, the message, was what mattered. Even Davis's fellow officers heard it. A few called him that night. Most didn't know what to say. Some just hung up halfway through the call. He didn't answer any of them. He sat on his couch, the TV flickering silently, his uniform jacket still hanging on the back of a chair. He kept seeing her face, not angry, not triumphant, just certain. He thought about everything he'd said, every line he'd rehearsed over the years, every talk about real toughness, every recruit he'd sized up with a glance. He realized, with slow, nauseating clarity, that he'd been performing strength his whole life, while that woman had been living it. He rubbed his temples, trying to make the shame go away. It didn't. At some point he stood, went to the mirror, looked at himself. The reflection stared back, medals, pressed uniform, a face that had memorized its own smirk. It all looked like costume now. He whispered, "What the hell am I doing?" The next morning he filed a report to his superior, requested a meeting. No excuses, no self-defense, just an admission. I acted without respect and professionalism. I need to do better. No one forced him to write it. He just knew he had to. Meanwhile, Leah walked through school halls transformed. People moved aside for him now, not out of fear but respect. A few tried to talk to him, to apologize. He didn't hold grudges. He didn't need to. He'd learned that from her. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all hit him, the looks, the whispers, the name, Seal Kid, that clung to him now. But every time it got heavy, he'd remember the feel of her hand on his shoulder. That hand said everything words couldn't. It said, "You don't need to prove anything. You already know who you are." Far from the noise, on a quiet naval pier lit by the last orange of sunset, Commander Anya Shaw stood alone. The sea was calm. The wind carried the faint smell of fuel and salt. She, showered, changed into clean fatigues, but fatigue still clung to her bones. She leaned on the railing, watching the water shift with the tide. There was peace here, but not the kind civilians imagined. Not freedom from war, just a momentary pause between missions. She thought of Leo, of his face when he'd seen her walk through those doors. Surprise, relief, maybe a hint of pride. That was worth more than any medal she'd ever received. But she also thought of Davis, the way he'd looked at her, first with arrogance, then with realization. She didn't hate him. In fact, a part of her pitied him. He was a man taught by a system that valued noise over depth, image over substance. A man who'd never learned the difference between power and presence. She closed her eyes, listening to the quiet slap of water against the pier. "Never let the noise of others disturb your inner calm," she whispered to herself, the same words she'd told Leo countless times. "Focus on the mission. Everything else is distraction." And for her, the mission was always the same. Serve, protect, guide. Even when no one's watching. She turned to leave as the last light faded, her silhouette blending with the twilight, a figure both ordinary and extraordinary, defined not by the medals on her chest, but by the silence she carried like armor. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it walks beside you quietly, eats lunch with you after battle, and asks if you still have questions about satellites. Because true strength doesn't need to be seen to be real. It just needs to show up. How fast does a story travel through the military? Faster than radio waves. Faster than rumor. Because when truth carries the scent of humility and discipline, it spreads like oxygen in fire. By the next morning, the Northwood lesson was already legend. It moved through the base like static, whispered between coffee breaks, retold in barracks, passed down the chain of command like an unofficial sermon. The details blurred, but the core remained the same. A lieutenant mocked a boy for his SEAL mother. Then the mother walked in with her team. And silence did the rest. At the officers' mess, a young ensign spoke with nervous excitement. She didn't say a word, sir, just walked in, and even the admiral stood for her. Across the table, an older chief petty officer just nodded slowly. "That's Commander Shaw for you," he said, his voice low. "Quiet storm. You don't hear about her much, but if you ever do, it's for something worth remembering. He stirred his coffee once, staring at the steam. They say she once ran a rescue op after being shot. Didn't tell anyone until it was over. That kind of person doesn't walk around asking for thanks. She earns it. Lieutenant Mark Davis sat in his superior's office that afternoon. No sunlight reached this room, just the sterile glow of fluorescent lights and the hum of a ceiling fan that seemed to judge him with every rotation. Across from him sat Commander Price, a woman known for her blunt honesty. She wasn't interested in theatrics, only in accountability. She set a tablet down on her desk, scrolling through a report. "You've had an interesting week, Lieutenant," she said, without looking up. Davis swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you deny what happened?" "No, ma'am." She finally looked up, not angry, just assessing. "Do you understand how many people have seen the footage?" His chest tightened. "Footage?" She nodded once. "A student recorded part of it, not the whole scene, but enough. You mocking the boy, the moment she walked in. You don't come off well, Davis." He looked down, ashamed. "I know." "Do you?" she asked quietly. "Do you understand why?" He hesitated. Then, "Because I disrespected the uniform." Price leaned back in her chair. "That's part of it, but it's deeper than that. You disrespected the silence that makes the uniform mean something." He frowned slightly, unsure. She folded her hands. "You think this job is about speeches, about recruiting, about inspiring kids. And yes, part of it is. But inspiration without humility turns into propaganda, and that's what you were selling." Her tone softened. "You mocked someone you didn't understand, Davis, and you did it while wearing the flag. That's not arrogance, that's blindness." The words hit him harder than any reprimand could. "I want you to take a week off," she said. "No uniform, no speeches. I've arranged something else for you." He looked up. "What kind of something?" She smiled, faint, deliberate. "A reminder." 2 days later, Davis stood at the entrance of the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Virginia. He hadn't been here in years, not since his early career. The smell of salt, mud, and diesel filled the air. In the distance, trainees ran drills in freezing surf, instructors barking orders. A man in dusty fatigues approached him, tall, broad, the kind of presence that didn't need rank to command respect. "Lieutenant Davis?" the man asked. "Yes, sir." "I'm Chief Morales. Commander Price said you'd be shadowing us this week." "Shadowing?" Morales grinned slightly. "Observing, learning, maybe sweating a little, depends on how much you talk." Davis almost smiled but stopped himself. "Yes, Chief." Morales started walking, and Davis followed. They passed trainees carrying logs, crawling through sand, sprinting between stations. The air was filled with shouts, grunts, and the rhythmic thunder of boots. "You know what I love about this place," Morales said. "It doesn't care who you were before you got here. Doesn't care about your GPA, your medals, your daddy's rank. You either earn it or you don't." They stopped near the edge of the beach, watching a small group of recruits do push-ups in ankle-deep water. Morales gestured toward them. "That's what Commander Shaw trains for. That's her world. She's been through this a dozen times and worse." Davis looked at the men in the surf, then back at Morales. "You know her?" Morales's eyes softened. "I served under her once, off the Horn of Africa. She doesn't yell, doesn't need to, you just know when she's in command." He took off his cap, wiped sweat from his brow. "You want to understand why everyone respects her. It's not because she's a SEAL. It's because she never forgets what she's serving, and she never lets ego get in the way of mission." Morales looked straight at him then. "You forgot that, didn't you, Lieutenant?" Davis didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was enough. Back in Northwood, life for Leo began to settle, at least on the surface. Classes resumed, tests returned, the cafeteria smelled like reheated pizza again. But something had shifted in how people saw him. The same classmates who'd laughed now nodded respectfully in hallways. A few even apologized, awkwardly, eyes down. He didn't hold it against them. His mother had taught him better than that. But what struck him most was how differently teachers treated him. One science teacher even asked if he'd like to give a short talk about leadership through example. He declined politely. He didn't want to talk about it. He wanted to understand it. That night, as he sat on the porch, his mother joined him, coffee in hand, wearing her usual gray hoodie and jeans. No uniform, no medals, just herself. "You've been quiet lately," she said softly. He shrugged, just thinking. "About what?" He hesitated. "About you." She raised an eyebrow. "Me?" He nodded. "Everyone at school thinks you're a superhero, but you don't act like one." She laughed gently, a sound so rare it caught him off guard. "That's because I'm not." "You kind of are," he said. Her eyes softened. "Leo, heroes are a story people tell to make sense of courage. But real courage doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like doing your job when no one's watching. Sometimes it's just showing up tired, scared, and still doing what has to be done." He listened quietly. She looked out at the dark yard. "You know what fear is, Leo." He thought for a moment. "Something to get over." She shook her head. "Something to understand. The people who pretend they don't feel fear are the ones it controls the most." Her tone was soft, reflective. "When I joined, I thought strength meant never showing weakness, never crying, never hesitating. But over time, I learned real strength is balance. It's knowing when to stand tall and when to kneel, when to fight and when to listen." Leo turned that over in his mind, trying to fit it into the world he knew: school hallways, crowded cafeterias, loud boys who mistook volume for confidence. He looked up at her. "So what do you do when people don't listen?" She smiled faintly. "You stay silent long enough that the truth becomes louder than their words." Back in Virginia, the week dragged on for Davis. No speeches, no microphones, no recruits to impress. Just mud, sweat, and silence. Chief Morales had made sure of it. Every morning, Davis ran drills with the candidates, not as one of them, but among them. He watched how they reacted to failure, how they encouraged each other, how the quiet ones often outlasted the loud. He began to understand something he'd forgotten years ago: the purity of effort, stripped of ego. One evening, after the last exercise, Morales handed him a canteen and gestured toward the horizon. The sun was melting into the sea, blood-orange light over gray waves. "You get it now?" Morales asked. Davis didn't answer immediately. He was watching a recruit help another up from the sand, both too exhausted to speak. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I do." Morales smirked. "Good. Then maybe next time you'll think before you open that mouth of yours." Davis chuckled quietly. "Yes, Chief." Morales looked out over the water. "You know, Shaw didn't get to where she is by demanding respect. She earned it, day after day, mission after mission. You meet someone like that once in your life if you're lucky. And if you're really lucky, you learn from them before it's too late." The words sank deep. Davis said nothing more. He didn't need to. That night, as the waves crashed softly against the shore, he sat alone outside the barracks, notebook in hand. He began to write, not a report, not a statement, just thoughts. About arrogance. About silence. About how a woman had walked into a high school gym and shown him everything the uniform was supposed to mean. By the time he closed the notebook, the stars were out, faint, distant but constant. He looked up at them and whispered, "Thank you, Commander." No one heard, but maybe that was the point. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, Anya Shaw sat at her kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling beside her. Leo was asleep. The house was quiet. She stared at the stack of mission files waiting to be signed, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment in the hall, the look on her son's face, the stillness before the salute. She didn't plan that day to teach anyone anything, but sometimes lessons happen in silence. And the best kind leave no scars, only reflection. She reached for her pen, signed the first document, then whispered softly to herself. Dignity doesn't speak, it acts. How long does it take to rebuild a name? Sometimes a lifetime. Sometimes one decision. For Lieutenant Mark Davis, redemption didn't come through grand gestures or apologies that begged to be heard. It came through silence. The same silence that had once condemned him now became the space in which he rebuilt himself. He no longer gave loud, polished speeches at high schools. He stopped standing on stages with spotlights and slogans. Instead, he began to visit smaller groups, cadet clubs, classrooms, local community halls, where the lights were fluorescent, the chairs metal, and the only thing that mattered was honesty. He didn't tell stories about war or glory. He told the truth. About the fear before deployment. The mistakes that stay with you longer than the medals ever will. And about a day when a woman in dusty combat gear walked into a room and showed him what real strength looks like. He never used her name. He didn't need to. Those who understood, understood. The rest would learn in time. At the Naval Training Command, a new phrase had begun circulating quietly among officers, a kind of moral shorthand. Remember Northwood. It meant many things, depending on who said it. For some, it was a reminder not to underestimate anyone, soldier, sailor, or civilian. For others, it meant to lead with humility, not with noise. And for a few, the ones who'd seen combat, it was a quiet nod to the kind of calm that only comes from having walked through chaos and back. When recruits complained about orders or questioned leadership, instructors sometimes just raised an eyebrow and said, "Northwood." That was enough. It became part of the unwritten code, a legend not born from battle, but from dignity. Meanwhile, Commander Anya Shaw sat in her office at Naval Special Warfare Command, paperwork spread across the desk. Outside, a storm rolled across the coastline, rain streaking the windows, thunder rolling like distant artillery. She had been home for only 3 weeks, and already the next operation loomed. A hostage recovery, fast, covert, uncertain. The kind that didn't make headlines but could change the world if it went wrong. Her fingers rested on the mission file, but her mind wasn't on logistics. It was on Leo. He'd been quiet since that day at school, not withdrawn, just different. A little older in the eyes, a little quieter in how he carried himself. She'd seen that look before, in soldiers after their first firefight. The moment when innocence cracks, and something stronger begins to grow in its place. It wasn't fair, she thought. He deserved a childhood unburdened by the weight of her world. But fairness was a luxury she'd long stopped believing in. The door opened softly behind her. Chief Morale stepped in, the same man who had guided Davis through his week of humility. "Ma'am," he said, nodding respectfully, "you're needed in briefing room 3. Anya looked up. "Already?" "Yes, ma'am, the operation's greenlit." She exhaled, leaned back, eyes tracing the storm through the window. "Understood, 10 minutes. Morales hesitated. "Permission to speak freely, Commander." "Always." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I heard about what happened at the school." She gave a faint smile. "I figured it would make the rounds." He nodded. "You did good, ma'am. The story's traveling. They're calling it the Northwood lesson." She raised an eyebrow. "They always need names for things." He chuckled. "Maybe, but it's a good one. People are learning from it." Anya's gaze drifted to the mission file again. "Let's just hope they learn the right lesson." Morales tilted his head. "Which is?" "That strength doesn't need an audience." He smiled faintly. "That's exactly the one they're learning." She closed the file and stood. Then maybe it was worth the noise. That night, she stopped by Leo's room before leaving. He was sitting at his desk, working on something, a small radio transmitter in pieces, wires and circuits scattered across the surface. She leaned against the doorframe. "You building another comms unit?" He looked up, grinning sheepishly. "Trying to. I think I messed up the frequency modulator." She walked in, crouched beside him, and examined the board. "You soldered the diode backward." He blinked seriously. She pointed. "See that marking, the white stripe? That's polarity. It matters which way it flows." He sighed. "I thought I had it right." She smiled. "Mistakes are just unfinished lessons." He smirked. "That sounds like something you tell a recruit." She tapped his shoulder lightly. "Maybe, but it applies to you too." They shared a quiet laugh, and then she grew serious. "I have to go again," she said softly. The words hung there, heavy, familiar. Leo nodded slowly. "How long?" "Not sure. Could be days, could be longer." He didn't look away this time, didn't beg her to stay. He just nodded again. "Be safe," he said. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Always." Then, after a pause, she added, "You know, you handled yourself well that day, better than most adults would have." He gave a small, proud shrug. "You taught me to stay calm." Her voice softened. "Then I did one thing right." She turned to leave, then stopped at the doorway. "Leo." He looked up. "Don't let the noise change you, ever." He smiled faintly. "Never do." 2 days later, Anya's team deployed. The operation was quiet, surgical, and wrapped in the usual layers of secrecy. But in moments between mission briefings and final checks, Anya found herself thinking of home, of Leo's unfinished circuit board, the way he'd looked at her when she said goodbye. She'd been on hundreds of missions, and each one carried its own weight. But this time felt different, not heavier, just more human. Because somewhere out there, a young boy was beginning to understand what she'd spent her whole life living. That strength and gentleness were not opposites. That silence could be the loudest answer of all. Back at the base, Chief Morales received a message through internal channels. Operation Kestrel complete. All assets accounted for. He smiled faintly. Of course she did. He closed the file and went back to his training schedule. Another batch of recruits waiting to be shaped. Before the day ended, he wrote a single phrase on the whiteboard above the locker room. "Stay humble, stay ready. Remember NORTHWOOD." The recruits saw it the next morning and asked what it meant. Morales just smirked. "You'll understand someday." Meanwhile, Davis sat at his desk late that evening, the room quiet except for the low hum of his laptop. He was preparing notes for another outreach talk, this time at a military academy. He read the first line of his speech, then crossed it out. Too polished, too practiced. He tried again. "Leadership," he wrote slowly, "isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about knowing when to be silent and when to listen." He stopped there, staring at the words. Then he added one more sentence. "I learned that from a woman who didn't need to prove anything." He closed the laptop. He'd say the rest from the heart. Days passed. The world moved on. But some stories linger, not because they demand to be remembered, but because they remind you of what matters. At Northwood High, the students still talked about that day sometimes. It had become part of the school's quiet folklore, something older students told the new ones when they asked why the annual career fair always ended 5 minutes early, out of tradition. No one ever laughed at that part. And in one of the classrooms, a teacher had framed a photo taken by a student that day, a blurry image of Commander Shaw and her team standing in that ordinary high school hallway. Below it, a simple caption written in chalk. "Respect is earned in silence." Back on deployment under a foreign sky, Anya and her team moved through darkness, silent, coordinated, unstoppable. Each movement was deliberate, each breath controlled. But beneath the precision, beneath the tactics and muscle memory, there was something deeper, a pulse that kept her steady. Leo's voice, faint but clear, echoing in her memory. "Be safe." She smiled under her breath as she checked her weapon one last time. "Always." When the extraction helicopter finally lifted off hours later, her team secure, Anya looked down at the coastline below, a ribbon of black against silver water. In that quiet between life and duty, she whispered to herself, "Sometimes dignity doesn't need an audience, it just needs to show up." By the time she returned home, a week later the storm had passed. The air smelled of wet pine and salt. Leo met her at the airport, no cameras, no ceremony, just him. He ran to her, threw his arms around her, and for the first time in months she let herself exhale. He didn't ask about the mission. She didn't offer details. Some things are sacred in silence. And as they walked to the car, side by side, she realized something profound. Her legacy wouldn't be written in medals or citations. It was walking right next to her. Sometimes stories are born from action. Sometimes from words. But the ones that last, the ones that become legend, are written in the quiet moments between the two. Because real power doesn't shout. It doesn't demand to be seen. It simply is. How does a boy grow up in the shadow of a legend? Carefully, quietly, and with a weight that never really leaves his shoulders. Months passed since the day the doors of the Northwood High Auditorium had opened and changed everything. Life resumed, classes, drills, deployments, but the echo of that moment still lingered in corners no one could see. Leo had stopped being the quiet kid. Now people called him something else, the commander's son. He didn't like it, not because he was ashamed, but because it felt like wearing someone else's armor, too heavy, too bright. He wasn't trying to live up to her. He was just trying to understand her. He joined the school's robotics team that spring, spending long hours in the lab soldering wires, programming servo motors, and learning to lead quietly, not by ordering but by listening. His teammates respected him, though none really knew why. Maybe it was his calm under pressure. Maybe it was the way he spoke softly but with certainty. During one late-night practice, a friend asked him, "Hey, Leo, what's your mom really like?" He looked up from the circuit board, thought for a long moment, then said, "She's like gravity." The friend blinked. "Gravity?" Leo smiled faintly. "Yeah, you don't see it, you just know it's there, keeps everything grounded." At that same hour, halfway across the world, Commander Anya Shaw crouched in a jungle ravine, rain pouring through dense foliage, mud swallowing her boots. Her breathing was steady, even as her team moved through the black, coordinated by hand signals, guided by instinct. Their mission was simple: intercept a convoy, recover 2 hostages, but simple never meant easy. She pressed her comms. Bravo 3, visual on the lead truck. A crackle then, affirmative, 3 vehicles, 10 hostiles minimum. She wiped water from her visor. On my mark, non-lethal if possible. Her tone was calm, always calm. Minutes later it was over. No one dead, hostages safe, extraction clean. When the helicopter's noise faded behind her, she sat in the dark for a moment, breathing. Then, when the rest of her team began to joke quietly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photo, faded, creased from years of folding. Leo, age 10, holding a wooden model jet they'd built together. She smiled softly in the dim light. "Still flying, kid," she whispered. Back home, Davis's redemption had turned into something more than repair. It had become purpose. He now trained new recruiters at the regional center, teaching them how to engage with future sailors, not with slogans but with sincerity. He began every session the same way. He'd stand in front of the room, no slides, no polished grin, and say, "If you want to serve this country, start by learning how to respect the people who already do." Sometimes he'd pause, scanning the young faces, and never assume you know what strength looks like. They didn't always understand at first, but by the end of their training, when they saw his humility, his patience, they got it. He never mentioned her name, but he carried her lesson in every word. One night after class, he stayed behind, cleaning the whiteboard. Chief Morales entered, arms crossed, that same smirk he'd worn since the first day they met. "You've changed, Davis," Morales said. Davis chuckled. "About time, huh?" Morales nodded. "You found your mission." Davis leaned on the desk. "You ever think people can't really change, Chief?" Morales shrugged. "They don't unless they're humbled first. Then they start rebuilding from what's real." He gestured at him. "You got humbled and you didn't waste it." Davis smiled quietly. "Guess we both owe her." Morales nodded. "We all do." Months later, a letter arrived for Anya, hand-stamped, official seal of the Department of the Navy. She opened it expecting orders, but instead it was something else. A commendation for distinguished service, the Silver Star Cluster, to be awarded privately. She placed the letter aside. She'd been through enough of those ceremonies to know medals never told the whole story. Still, when Leo saw the envelope and asked what it was, she didn't hide it. She showed him the letter. He read it silently, eyes tracing the words, then looked up. "You're not going to the ceremony." She shook her head. "No need." "Why not?" "Because the work doesn't end when they pin something on you," she said softly. "It ends when you've done right by the people you serve." Leo nodded slowly, thinking. Then he said, "But I think you should go." She tilted her head. "Why?" "Because maybe people need to see what quiet looks like when it stands on stage." She smiled at that, not wide but genuine. "You're getting wise, kid." He shrugged. "Guess it runs in the family." At the ceremony, weeks later, the small room was filled with uniformed officers, quiet dignity, and a few civilians in formal wear. Anya stood at the podium as Admiral Hayes pinned the medal to her chest. Cameras clicked, but she kept her eyes on the Admiral's steady calm. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't read from notes. She said simply, "Recognition isn't why we serve, but when it finds us, we stand here not for what we did alone, but for those who carried us through it. My team, my family, and those who remind us what strength really means." She glanced toward Leo in the front row, "Even when that reminder comes from home." A soft ripple of laughter, respectful, warm. Then silence again, the kind that meant people were listening. Later that evening, after the ceremony, Admiral Hayes found her alone on the terrace. The city lights shimmered below like a second sky. "Hell of a speech, Commander," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. "Thank you, sir." He took a sip of his own, studying her. "You know, I've been in this business 40 years. Seen soldiers break, rebuild, rise, fall. But I've rarely seen anyone command respect the way you do without saying much of anything." She smiled faintly. "Words are overrated, sir." He chuckled. "Maybe, but they still matter. The story of Northwood, it's made its rounds, you know." She sighed softly. "So I've heard." "It's changed people," he said. "Even Davis, you should be proud." She looked out at the horizon. "Pride's a dangerous thing, Admiral, but I'm glad something good came from it." He nodded, understanding. "Still, we need more like you." She turned to him, serious now. "No, sir, you need more like us, people who lead quietly, not more noise, more balance." Hayes smiled. "Fair point, Commander, fair point." That night, when they returned home, Leo couldn't stop looking at the medal on her chest. She noticed. "You can touch it," she said, amused. He reached out carefully, fingers brushing the cool metal. "It's heavy." "So is what it stands for." He looked up at her. "Do you ever get scared?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Every time, but courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing your job anyway." He thought about that for a while, then asked, Do you ever wish you picked something else? Her eyes softened. Sometimes, but if I had, I might not have met the people I've met or learned what I've learned. He smiled. Like what? She took a deep breath. That the strongest people aren't the loudest. They're the ones who carry their fear, their doubt, their pain, and still show up. Leo nodded. Like you did for me. She froze for a second, the simplicity of his words hitting her harder than any metal ever had. Then she smiled softly. Yeah, like that. Weeks later, back on base, Davis was packing up after a long day when a young recruit approached him, nervous, hesitant. Sir, the recruit said, I just wanted to say that story you told us about the woman, the one who taught you respect, it stuck with me. Davis looked up surprised. Yeah. Yes, sir, I was gonna quit. Thought I wasn't cut out for this. But that line you said, never assume you know what strength looks like, it made me stay. Davis nodded, emotion tightening in his chest. I'm glad it did. The recruit saluted. Thank you, sir. When he left, Davis sat for a while, the room dim except for the glow of the desk lamp. He whispered to himself, You're still teaching, Commander. And in that silence he knew this was his mission now. At home, Leo sat at his desk, finishing the last line of a scholarship essay. The prompt, describe a moment that changed how you see the world. He paused, then wrote, I learned that true strength isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who shows up when it matters, even when no one's watching. He smiled, reading it over. Then he added one last sentence. My mother taught me that without saying a word. Because sometimes the greatest lessons aren't spoken. They're lived. In silence. In storms. And in the quiet strength that walks beside you, even when the world isn't looking. What happens when silence breaks? When even the calmest storm finally finds its edge? For Commander Anya Shaw, that question stopped being philosophical the moment the radio went dead. Her team had been deep inside a remote mountain valley, an extraction mission turned chaotic by bad intel and worsening weather. A drone had gone down. Their evac zone had shifted. And now, as night pressed in, their comms were a mess of static and half-words. She crouched in the mud, one hand on her earpiece. Base, this is Kestrel, do you copy? Nothing, just wind and distance. The team's medic looked at her, face lit by the faint green glow of his NVGs. Comms are fried, ma'am. Might be a jammer on the ridge. Anya didn't answer immediately. She scanned the darkness, mind already working routes, terrain, time to exfil, risk of detection. Then we find another way, she said finally. Pack up, we move in 5. No panic, no wasted breath. Just decision. Her voice carried the same calm it always did, the kind that steadies hearts even when everything else starts to fall apart. But inside she felt the strain, the exhaustion, the quiet fear that always lived beneath command. Because leadership wasn't about not feeling fear. It was about carrying it and walking anyway. Back home, Leo was sitting on the porch, watching the rain trace patterns on the wood railing. He always knew when she was away, the house felt different, quieter somehow. It wasn't absence that hurt him most, it was the not knowing. He checked the time on his phone again. No message, no update, just the same old news cycle humming about things that never said enough. He looked up at the sky, gray and endless. You're out there, huh, he murmured, doing what you do. He tried to sound brave, but his voice cracked on the last word. He'd inherited her patience, but not her armor, not yet. At the Naval Command Center, Chief Morale stood over a bank of monitors, tension in his jaw. Still no word from Kestrel team. A young officer shook his head. Negative, Chief. Last ping was 2 hours ago before the storm cut satellite link. Morales nodded grimly. He didn't say what he was thinking, that this wasn't the first time Anya had gone dark. She'd always come back, always, but the word always has a fragile meaning in war. Keep scanning, he said. She'll find a way to reach us. He turned, walking toward the observation deck, hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the sea raged under the same storm that hid her from their maps. He whispered to himself, "Come on, Kestrel. You don't owe the world another miracle, but I'd appreciate one more." In the valley, hours later, the rain had stopped. The air was thick with mist. Anya led her team along the narrow path, the moon a faint ghost above the clouds. They moved silently, one step at a time, every sense stretched thin. Then came the sound, distant, faint, mechanical. Rotors. The evac. But it was early, too early. Her instincts kicked in. She raised her fist, the silent command for stop. Everyone froze. The sound grew louder, closer. But something was off, the rhythm of the blades, the approach vector. She knew that sound. That wasn't friendly. Ambush, she whispered. The valley erupted with light and noise. Tracer rounds cut through the fog like molten wire. The team hit the dirt, returning fire, their silhouettes flashing in the muzzle bursts. Anya crawled behind a fallen log, scanning through her scope, calculating angles, distances, and probabilities, all in seconds. Bravo 2, flank left. Delta, cover the medic, smoke now. Her voice was steady, clipped, precise. She moved like a conductor guiding chaos into rhythm. Then an explosion. Not close enough to kill, but close enough to throw her against the ground. Her head rang, vision blurred, but when she blinked the world back into focus, she was already pushing herself up again. Her team was still fighting, holding, moving, surviving. And she was still their anchor. Back in the States, Davis sat in his car outside the recruiting office long after closing. He wasn't sure why he was there. Maybe habit, maybe the silence. He turned the radio on low volume. A news update. Reports indicate a U.S. Special Operations team is currently unaccounted for during a classified mission overseas. Details remain undisclosed. Davis froze. No names, no unit identifiers. But something in his gut twisted, that cold, unmistakable pull. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used since the day he met her. Morales answered on the third ring. "Chief, it's Davis, I heard." "Yeah," Morales interrupted. His tone was calm but heavy. "She's out there, radio's dead, we're waiting." "Is there anything I can?" "Not this time, Lieutenant. Just keep the noise quiet back home. That's what she'd want." The call ended, but Davis didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the dark windshield, whispering, "You better come back, Commander." Hours passed in that valley. The firefight had died down. The attackers were gone. Her team was alive, battered, bruised, but alive. They'd found temporary cover in a cave system, setting up a defensive perimeter while the medic worked on patching a shoulder wound. Anya sat by the entrance, scanning the rain-slick slope outside. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, eyes hollow but alert. One of her men, a young operator named Kellen, crawled up beside her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we're good for now, you should rest." She shook her head, "Not until we're out." He hesitated, permission to speak freely. "Go ahead." He looked at her, hesitant, nervous. "You ever think about home, about how long we can keep doing this?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, where the first hint of dawn was bleeding into the clouds. "Every day," she said softly, "and every time I do, I remember why we keep doing it." He nodded slowly, "For them." She turned, meeting his eyes, "For them and for each other." Then she added, quieter, "But sometimes you also have to know when to let go." Kellen frowned. "You thinking of retiring, ma'am?" She smiled faintly, "Just thinking about what comes next." By mid-morning, the storm had cleared enough for air support to locate them. The evac bird came in low, kicking up dust and leaves as the team ran for the pickup. Anya was last to board. She turned once, scanning the valley one last time as if trying to memorize it. Then she climbed in, the doors closing with a heavy metallic thud. As they lifted into the sky, her hand went instinctively to her chest pocket, the photo. It was still there. Leo, 10 years old, holding that model jet. She let herself smile, small, tired, but real. Back home, Leo was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to do homework he couldn't focus on, when the front door opened. He looked up and froze. There she was, mud on her boots, fatigue in her shoulders, but alive. He stood so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "Mom." She smiled that same quiet smile. "Hey, kid." He ran to her and hugged her tight. She winced a little, bruised ribs, but didn't pull away. When he finally stepped back, he said, "I saw on the news." "I know. You were out there, weren't you?" "I was." He swallowed. "Was it bad?" She looked at him for a long time, really looked, then said softly, "It could have been worse." He nodded, not needing more. Some truths don't need details. Just presence. That night after he'd gone to bed, Anya sat on the porch, a cup of coffee steaming beside her. The stars were faint behind clouds, but she watched them anyway. She thought of everything, the mission, the valley, the silence, the boy asleep inside. For years she'd balanced between two worlds, the one she served and the one she loved. But lately she could feel the weight shifting. Maybe it was time to choose. She didn't fear death, she feared absence, the kind that steals memories before they're made. As the wind moved softly through the trees, she whispered, "One more mission, just one more." But deep down, she knew that's what she'd told herself for years. Across the country, in a quiet barracks office, Davis sat writing again, this time a letter handwritten, something rare these days. He began simply, "Commander Shaw, you once said dignity doesn't speak, it acts. You were right. The silence you left behind has taught me more than every briefing, every lecture, every medal combined. Wherever you are, I hope you know that your lessons didn't end in that auditorium. They began there. Respectfully, Lt. Mark Davis." He folded the letter, unsure if he'd ever send it. Maybe it wasn't meant to be read. Maybe it was meant to be written. And so, in 3 different corners of the same world, a soldier, a mother, and a man trying to become better than he was, all sat awake under the same night sky, bound by something stronger than rank or distance. Not war, not duty, but quiet respect. Because sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with bullets, but with silence, patience, and the courage to change. How do you know when it's time to let go? When the fight no longer feels like purpose, but like habit. For Commander Anya Shaw, that question followed her home like a shadow she couldn't shake. Weeks had passed since the mission in the valley. The news cycle had moved on. The world kept spinning, but inside her something had shifted. Her uniform still hung by the door, boots lined in perfect order, gear packed for next time. But for the first time in years, she wasn't sure if there should be a next time. It wasn't fear. It wasn't fatigue. It was something quieter, the slow realization that she'd spent so much of her life fighting to protect the world that she'd barely lived in it. Leo's laughter from the next room reached her through the walls, faint, real, grounding. She closed her eyes. That sound was her reason for everything. But maybe it was time to stop living in the in-between, half at home, half at war. That same night, hundreds of miles away, Davis sat across from Chief Morales at a diner near the base. The table was littered with coffee mugs and folded napkins scribbled with notes. "I got word," Morales said, stirring his cup slowly. "She's thinking of stepping down." Davis looked up, retiring. Morales nodded. "She hasn't said it outright, but yeah, I think she's ready." Davis leaned back in the booth, the weight of the news settling deep in his chest. She's earned it. Hell, she's earned 10 retirements. Morales smiled faintly. You ever think about meeting her again, face to face? Davis hesitated. Every day, but I'm not sure what I'd say. Say thank you, Morales said simply. Davis exhaled, nodding slowly. Maybe I will. Morales sipped his coffee, eyes distant. Funny thing, isn't it? Sometimes the people who change us the most barely speak to us at all. Davis smiled, soft, almost nostalgic. Yeah, she didn't need to. At home, Leo sat on the porch steps, watching the streetlights flicker on. He was 17 now, taller, sharper, carrying the same quiet focus as his mother. He held a letter in his hand, a recruitment brochure for a Navy preparatory program. He hadn't told her about it yet, not because he was hiding it, but because he didn't know if it would make her proud or scared. Maybe both. He looked up when she came outside, a blanket around her shoulders, her hair loose for once. Still up, she asked. He nodded, couldn't sleep. She sat beside him, the wooden step creaking under her weight. The night was cool and still. After a while, she noticed the brochure in his hand. What's that? He hesitated, then handed it to her. She unfolded it, the Navy crest shining faintly under the porch light. When she looked up, his eyes were steady. I've been thinking about joining, he said. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared at him, as though weighing 1,000 memories in silence. Then she asked softly, why? He swallowed. Because I want to understand what you've given your life to. I want to know what it takes to stand where you stand. Her throat tightened. Leo, the life I chose, it's not what people think. It's not medals or headlines, it's sacrifice, silence, and distance. He nodded. I know, I've seen it. She smiled faintly. You've seen part of it, but there's a cost you don't understand yet. He looked at her, eyes fierce and young and unbroken. Then let me. The quiet stretched between them, a mother seeing herself reflected in the courage of her son and realizing that some legacies aren't chosen. They're inherited. She exhaled slowly, a small, resigned laugh slipping out. You really are my kid. Days later, she stood in the Admiral's office, her resignation letter on the desk. Admiral Hayes read it silently, then looked up, frowning. You sure about this, Commander? Yes, sir. He leaned back, studying her. I won't try to talk you out of it. God knows you've given enough, but I have to ask what changed. She hesitated, then said, I realized I've spent 20 years teaching others how to fight. Maybe it's time I teach my son how to live. The Admiral nodded slowly. You've earned that right. But know this, Anya, men and women like you, they never really leave the fight. It stays in you. She smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time to make peace with it. He extended his hand. Whatever you do next, Commander, you'll still be one of us. She shook his hand firmly. Thank you, sir. When she stepped outside, the afternoon light was warm on her face, bright, unfiltered, ordinary. For years, she'd known only the light of foreign skis, harsh, colorless, fleeting. This was different. This was home. She looked out across the parking lot, where families reunited, sailors laughed, and life, normal, messy life, carried on. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel the need to look over her shoulder. She was free. Or so she thought. The call came 2 weeks later. Not from the Navy, from Davis. She almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, but something made her pick up. Commander Shaw. His voice had changed, steadier, older, humble. Yes, who's this? Mark Davis, ma'am, Lieutenant Davis. We met at Northwood High. A pause, long quiet. She almost smiled. I remember. I didn't expect you to, he said softly, but I've wanted to thank you for a long time. You already did, she replied, by learning the lesson. I tried, he said, but I don't think I ever really said what I needed to. She leaned against the counter, her voice low. "Go ahead." There was a breath on the other end, then. "You changed my life, Commander. You didn't humiliate me. You didn't punish me. You just showed up. And somehow that said everything." She closed her eyes. "I didn't do it to teach you anything." "I know," he said. "That's why it worked." Silence again, soft, not awkward, the kind that carries meaning. Finally he asked, "You still serving?" "Not anymore." There was a pause. "Then the Navy's losing one of its best." She smiled. "It'll survive, it always does." He chuckled quietly, still humble as ever. "Still learning," she said. Then, after a beat, "Thank you, Lieutenant, for calling." "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly, "for reminding me what respect really looks like." They ended the call with no promises, no plans, just understanding. Sometimes that's enough. That evening, Anya drove to the beach, the same stretch of coastline where she'd trained years before. The wind was cool, the tide low. She took off her shoes, walked along the wet sand until the horizon swallowed the sun. The sound of the waves felt like memory. Every mission, every silence, every person she couldn't save. And then Leo, the one she still could. She stood there for a long time, watching the last light fade. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and took out her trident, the insignia of her service. It was tarnished, edges worn smooth by years of sweat and time. She turned it over in her hand, then knelt and pressed it gently into the sand. The tide would take it eventually. But she didn't feel loss. She felt release. Later that night, Leo found her sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of tea in her hands. He hesitated at the doorway. "You okay?" She smiled softly. "Better than I've been in a long time." He sat down across from her. "Did you decide something?" She nodded. "Yeah, I'm done." "With the Navy?" "With chasing the next mission." He smiled, relieved. "Good." She raised an eyebrow. "Good." He grinned. "Means you'll finally have time to help me fix the transmitter." She laughed, the kind of laugh that sounded like sunlight after years of storms. "Guess I will." He paused, then added, "I talked to a recruiter today." She blinked, surprised. "You did?" He nodded. "I'm not enlisting yet, just learning, seeing if it's really what I want." She studied him, eyes soft. "And what do you think?" He shrugged. "I think I want to serve, but not because of you, because of me." Her smile deepened. "That's the only right reason." He nodded, then reached across the table, his voice quiet. "You're proud, right?" Her eyes shimmered faintly in the warm light. "More than you'll ever know." That night, long after he'd gone to bed, she sat in the living room, the hum of the house around her. Her phone buzzed once, a message from Davis. "For what it's worth, Commander, the lesson's still spreading. Every time someone forgets what strength means, we remind them, remember Northwood." She smiled. Maybe some stories never end. They just echo, passed from soldier to recruit, from mother to son, from mistake to redemption. And maybe that was enough. Because in the end, silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of meaning. The space where strength reveals itself, not in words but in choice. And sometimes, the bravest thing a soldier can do is come home. When the noise finally fades, what's left? Sometimes it's not victory, not applause, just peace, quiet, unassuming, and complete. Months had passed since Anya turned in her badge, her trident, her service weapon. She still woke at 500 out of habit, still folded her blanket tight, still double-checked the locks before bed. Some instincts never fade. But for the first time in years, the silence that filled her mornings didn't feel like punishment. It felt like permission. She started teaching part-time tactical leadership at a small military academy. Not drills or marksmanship, but ethics. The kind of lessons that couldn't be found in manuals. Her students called her ma'am. They didn't know her past, not the missions, not the medals. To them, she was just a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a voice that made you listen. And that was enough. One afternoon after class, a young cadet approached her, nervous, barely 18. "Ma'am," he said, "can I ask something?" She nodded. "Go ahead." "You were talking about leadership today. You said real leaders don't chase glory, but what do they chase?" She paused, considering her answer carefully, then said softly, "They chase responsibility, even when no one's watching." The cadet frowned thoughtfully, then nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." As he walked away, she smiled faintly. Different uniform, same lesson. Meanwhile, Leo had started his first year at the Naval Preparatory Academy. He wasn't the loudest, wasn't the strongest, but there was something about him, the way he listened, the calm in his tone, the steadiness in his movements. He carried himself differently, not like someone trying to prove anything, but like someone who already understood what mattered. During an early training exercise, a teammate panicked mid-course, froze halfway through a rope climb. The others shouted at him to move. Leo didn't. He just climbed back down, looked the boy in the eye, and said quietly, "One step at a time. I've got you." The boy nodded, trembling, but he made it. Later, the instructor asked Leo why he'd stopped to help. Leo shrugged. "Because sometimes you don't lead from the front, you lead from wherever you're needed." The instructor just stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "You sound like someone I used to know." Back home, Davis stood at a podium in a small auditorium, speaking to a group of new Navy recruiters. No screens, no slides, just him and his voice. "I want to tell you a story," he said, "about a moment that changed the way I see strength." He paused, letting the silence settle. "There was a woman, a commander. I mocked her once, thought I knew better, thought her silence meant weakness." He looked down, smiled faintly. "But then she walked into a room with her team, a team that would have followed her anywhere. And I realized silence doesn't mean weakness. It means control. It means dignity." He let the words hang there, the kind that don't need explanation. "Respect," he finished quietly, "isn't given to those who shout the loudest. It's earned by those who show up when it matters." When the session ended, a few of the younger officers stayed behind to thank him. One of them said, "Sir, that story, is it true?" Davis smiled, every word. Weeks later, Davis received a letter in the mail. No return address, just his name written in clean, deliberate handwriting. Inside was a single photo, the Northwood Auditorium, years ago. He was in the background, half turned. In the center, Anya Shaw standing in uniform, Leo beside her. On the back, in neat handwriting, "Some lessons stay long after the moment ends. A.S." He read it twice, then set it gently on his desk. He didn't need more words. The message was clear. At the academy, Leo called home once a week. Their conversations were short, half laughter, half updates, but they always ended the same way. "You good, Mom?" "I'm good, kid. You?" "Trying to be." "Trying enough." Those calls became their rhythm, small reminders that connection didn't need drama. It just needed honesty. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Leo sat alone on the training field, looking at the insignia patch on his sleeve. He didn't wear her trident, he never asked for it. But in some quiet way, he carried it, not as a symbol but as a memory. He whispered softly, "I'll make you proud." The wind carried the words away, but maybe somewhere she heard them. Back at her house, Anya was cleaning out the old storage room, boxes from deployments, old mission logs, photos yellowed with time. She found a sealed envelope at the bottom of a crate. It was from Davis, the letter he'd written but never mailed. Morales must have sent it to her after he passed away. The date on the corner said 6 months earlier. She sat down, the room still, the letter trembling slightly in her hands as she read. Commander Shaw, you once said dignity doesn't speak, it acts. You were right. The silence you left behind taught me everything I didn't know how to learn on my own. I hope wherever you are, you know that your strength became ours. She read it twice, tears pricking her eyes. Davis, the man who once mocked her, had become her echo. Not in rank, not in power, but in purpose. She folded the letter carefully, placed it inside a small wooden box beside the photo of Leo. Then she whispered, "Rest easy, Lieutenant, you got it right." A few weeks later, she was invited to speak at a Navy mentorship summit. It wasn't about tactics or leadership structures. It was about human resilience. She stood at the podium, hands steady, voice calm. "When I first joined, I thought strength was measured in victories," she began. "But time and people taught me that it's measured in something else." She paused, eyes scanning the crowd. "In restraint, in compassion, in knowing when to fight and when to forgive." She took a deep breath. "Years ago, someone once mocked my service. I didn't respond with anger. I responded by standing beside those who believed in me. And in doing so, I learned that silence can be the loudest answer of all." A long stillness filled the room. No applause yet, just the kind of silence that meant people were feeling something. Then slowly they stood. Applause followed. Not the cheering kind, the respectful kind. The kind that means we understand. That night she returned home to find a letter waiting on the counter, addressed to her, from the academy. Leo's handwriting. She opened it, heart already tightening. "Mom, I'm not writing because I'm in trouble. I'm writing because I understand now. You once told me courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing your job anyway. I didn't get it then, I do now. We had our first field exercise today. It was tough, someone panicked. I helped him through it. I think that's what you've always done for me. Love you, Leo." Her breath caught halfway through reading. She set the letter down, eyes wet, smile soft. And for the first time in a long, long while, she felt it, not pride, not relief, but peace. Her son didn't need her to be a hero. He just needed her to be human. Months later, Leo stood at graduation, uniform crisp, posture steady. He spotted her in the crowd, simple clothes, calm smile, eyes full of quiet pride. When the ceremony ended, he walked straight to her. She hugged him tight. "You did it," she whispered. He pulled back, grinning. "Guess it runs in the family." She laughed softly. "Maybe, but you did it your way." He nodded. "Because of you." They stood there for a moment, no words needed. The world around them roared with noise, families, bands, celebration. But between them was just silence. Warm, full, complete. Years later, when people at the academy spoke about Commander Anya Shaw, they didn't talk about her medals or missions. They talked about the way she walked into a room, calm, certain, unshakable. About the way her presence alone changed people. And when they spoke of her son, they didn't call him the commander's boy. They called him Leo Shaw, the officer who led quietly, who earned respect without demanding it. And if you asked him where he learned it, he'd just smile and say, "At home." Because legends aren't always loud. They're built in moments, quiet, steady human moments, when someone chooses restraint over rage, empathy over ego, service over recognition. That's how dignity speaks. Not in words, not in medals, but in the lives it changes, long after the mission ends. And sometimes, dignity doesn't speak at all. It simply acts.